a conspiracy with Joshua Fabia. Like the most craziest ever. Like no UFC career has ever ended the way my UFC career ended.
This is the voodoo coach that would be Diego Sanchez's corner. No one else. This dude has no experience as an MMA coach, by the way. So this is the dude that's telling him to be like Tyson.
He's being like water right now.
What is he doing?
Slip?
In a way, yeah. In a way, it was blackmail. This guy was such a master manipulator that I truly believe that this guy was like a end of times prophet.
I've bled, I've sweat, I've cried. I've cried for this company. I've sacrificed more than you will ever know. And you can't have a 45 minutes to meet with it? Oh, but you'll meet with Clay Guida.
Diego Sanchez is a UFC legend who won the respect of fight fans across multiple legendary fights stretching all the way back from when Diego announced he'd fired his longtime coaches Jackson Wink in favor of being coached by a complete unknown self-help guru and master manipulator with no real martial arts experience. It would set off a chaotic chain of events that would destroy Diego Sanchez's UFC career and his credibility. Martial arts has always had its fair share of frauds and fakers, such as Steven Seagal or Charlie Zelenoff. But rarely have we ever seen a fraud infiltrate the elite levels of martial arts to the degree that Joshua Fabia was able to do by manipulating and controlling Diego Sanchez. Despite having no real MMA credentials, Fabia was Diego Sanchez's only coach for multiple years across 4 UFC fights, with a litany of crazy and wild moments, such as training techniques that included chasing fighters with a knife and using Diego hanging upside down as a punching bag. But while his wacky training methods were kind of funny, there was nothing funny about the cultish tactics Joshua Fabia used to control Diego's life for his own benefit, to the detriment of Diego Sanchez. This video tells the crazy true story of how conman Joshua Fabia destroyed Diego Sanchez's career and made him the laughingstock of mixed martial arts. For MMA fans, Diego the Nightmare Sanchez should need no introduction. Legend is often an overused term in sports these days, but Diego Sanchez is undoubtedly an MMA and UFC legend, stemming back from when he became the first ever winner of The Ultimate Fighter way back in 2005, with Diego's series being credited as saving the UFC from bankruptcy thanks to Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonner's legendary fight. In his 15-year UFC career, Diego Sanchez established himself as a fan favorite and racked up countless accolades, such as his legendary fight with Clay Guida being inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. He has earned 7 Fight of the Night bonuses and has multiple absolute classic fights. When Diego Sanchez does retire from MMA, he will 100% be inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame for his immense contributions to the sport. While Diego had earned respect from the fans inside the cage, he was also respected outside of the cage as a nice and personable guy, highlighted when he took the time out to train and have a fight with a man who has Down syndrome and had been struggling since the death of his mother, but had always dreamt of having an MMA fight. A really wholesome moment that shows the side of Diego that people grew to love. Being a native of New Mexico, Diego had fought out of the legendary Jackson Wink MMA Academy in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he is credited with putting the gym on the map by winning The Ultimate Fighter in 2005. Since then, legends such as BJ Penn, John Jones, Rashad Evans and Andrei Arlovsky have trained at Jackson Wink, with multiple championships on the gym's resume. With Diego Sanchez's reputation and legendary status cemented, a great team surrounding him, and Dana White happy to keep giving him fights despite his advancing age, Diego Sanchez was in a fantastic position for the rest of his career before enjoying a well-earned retirement. However, his life was completely turned upside down when conman Joshua Fabia wormed his way into Diego's life and became his coach, trainer, manager, therapist, mentor, and best friend. And he led Diego into destroying his career. While to the casual fan, it may have seemed like Diego had everything in his life together, the reality was actually very different, and it was this instability that made Diego Sanchez a ripe target for a conman like Joshua Fabia. Diego Sanchez had previously shown a worrying susceptibility to getting scammed, as well as falling into the trappings of fame, like partying and addiction to alcohol and drugs. Just months after Diego Sanchez's fight of the year against Clay Guida in 2009, he discovered that a friend he had entrusted to look after his finances had actually scammed him for $150,000. No small sum for a UFC fighter, especially in 2009 when purses were even smaller than they are now. This scam, combined with his excessive partying, meant Diego's finances were a complete mess, and he hit rock bottom with $230,000 owed in taxes. These financial problems only increased his dependency on alcohol and drugs, which then began to impact his performances in the cage. Diego was sparked to turn his life around when he found out that he had fathered a child with a woman he had slept with a few years back. After looking at the child, Diego was convinced it looked like him and immediately took the child in and raised it as his own, while using the new addition to the family as fuel to get his career back on track. However, a few years later, when the mother of this child began to give him issues regarding custody, it resulted in Diego taking a court-mandated DNA test that proved he wasn't even the father and had been conned into raising the kid by the mother. While this could have sent Diego Sanchez's life spiraling, he instead dedicated himself to Jesus and became even more religious than he already was, and his career continued to plow on for years to come. Unfortunately, there was further turmoil to come for Diego, and this turmoil would produce the opportunity for Joshua Fabia to worm his way into Diego's life. As Diego aged, his performances naturally began to decline, and he began to get knocked out more frequently. These knockouts, combined with the fact that Diego had been in countless wars over the years, concerned his wife, who wanted him to retire before he got seriously hurt. Diego refused to retire and took this as his wife not believing in him anymore and giving up on him, something that would eventually lead to them separating.
I pushed my ex-wife away because she was pushing me towards retirement, and she didn't want to see me get hurt. And I took it as, you're giving up on me. You don't believe in me. And we went our separate ways. So I was in a real rocky road.
The pain of his divorce was combined with the feeling that his declining ability meant his longtime coaches at Jackson Wink were no longer giving him enough attention. This left Diego feeling abandoned and vulnerable, as he described here.
There was not much attention to me at Jackson Wink. I was basically just training myself, and this also was very disheartening for me, because I knew I was coming to the end, and coming to the end and not having support from your wife and not having support from your team, you could see where I was at.
With Diego vulnerable heading into a fight with up-and-comer Mickey Gall, he found salvation from an unlikely source when he met fellow Albuquerque native Joshua Fabia 10 days before the fight. Fabia positioned himself as a coach and guru who could help elevate Diego to new levels while also being the friend Diego desperately needed. As the fight was just 10 days away, they had very limited time to work together, with 95% or more of the work being done by Diego's longtime coaches at Jackson Wink. But when Diego turned in one of the best performances of his career and earned his first performance of the night bonus ever, it was Joshua Fabia who took most of the credit. Fabia made it clear that he was the one providing value and he was the reason for Diego's performance, despite the fact he'd only worked with him for 10 days and wasn't in his corner at the fight.
The first one that I'm involved in is the best fight he's had in 10 years. Nobody wants to acknowledge and give me credit for that. No public media says anything, but if I'm obviously the only thing new, it might be that.
To the outside world, these claims seemed laughable, but unfortunately Diego was not laughing and instead was fully bought into the BS that Fabia was selling him. After the Mickey Gall fight, Diego took the decision to fire his longtime trainers at Jackson Wink and instead align himself with Joshua Fabia as his only coach. From there, Fabia would start to control more and more aspects of Diego's life under the guise of supporting Diego and giving him the attention that he wasn't getting before. But to understand how unexpected it was for Diego to fire his Jackson Wink coaches in favor of Fabia, we need to understand a bit more about Joshua Fabia's background and what qualified him to coach at the highest level of mixed martial arts. Prior to becoming Diego Sanchez's only coach, Joshua Fabia wasn't exactly coaching at the top level of martial arts competition. In fact, he wasn't even coaching martial arts at all. In fact, Fabia would claim that he never even asked to be a part of the MMA world in the first place.
I am coming from the outside, completely. I never asked to be here. I never said, I'm in your market, I want to get an MMA team.
So if Joshua Fabia wasn't coaching MMA before he became a UFC fighter's coach, what was he doing? Well, for some background, we can check his website, which is named School of Self-Awareness. Joshua Fabia describes himself as a healer who at the age of just 9 healed his grandfather to an almost full recovery after a heart attack and brain aneurysm. Fabia describes himself as having a deep understanding of a wide range of topics, including, but not limited to, self-defense, confidence building, meditation, massage, physical therapy, and human rights. He also claims to be certified in personal training, several military fields, breathing, and crucially, martial arts. However, there is no claims regarding the types of martial arts he is trained in or any achievements he has had in this field, which is somewhat odd for someone coaching a UFC fighter. Fabia says this plethora of skills he has were learnt, and I quote, from the elders and leaders across the world in travels that took him through forests, jungles, and deserts. If your bullshit detector isn't going off at this point, or you're unable to see why Joshua Fabia is completely unqualified to be the head trainer of a UFC fighter, then I have a super hot new cryptocurrency to tell you that's going to the moon and is definitely not a scam. Prior to wrangling his way into being Diego Sanchez's coach, it seems that Fabia's main source of income was not coaching martial arts, but instead running various spiritual type workshops and classes related to things such as self-confidence, meditation, and breathwork. Not exactly Muay Thai or Jiu-Jitsu, is it? However, the fact that Joshua Fabia wasn't training any other fighters meant he could devote 100% of his time to coaching Diego and supporting him in any way possible, and Fabia quickly made sure to control as much of Diego's life as possible by appointing himself as Diego's manager, taking control of all of his social media, and putting himself in the spotlight whenever possible. With Jackson Wink completely out of the picture and Fabia behind the wheel, the wildest era of Diego Sanchez's career was about to begin. As mentioned previously, Fabia had been involved in the build-up to Diego Sanchez's fight with Mickey Gall, which he had won convincingly. However, Fabia was not part of the corner team and only worked with Diego for 10 days, with almost all of the preparation for the fight being done by the coaches at Jackson Wink. So the first proper fight for Diego Sanchez with Fabia as his coach would come against Michael Chiesa. Diego made the odd decision to only have Fabia in his corner for the fight, unlike pretty much every fighter I've ever seen who has multiple people in their corner. This decision was puzzling and led to people wondering what was going on and why Diego had so much trust in Fabia to the point he felt he didn't need any other coaching. This intrigue led the MMA community to do a bit of research into Fabia, and they found that his bizarre website that in no way made it seem like he was qualified to train a UFC fighter. MMA fans also found bizarre video clips of Fabia on the internet from his self-help style classes he'd been giving prior to coaching Diego that made his MMA expertise seem laughable. The strange situation of UFC legend Diego Sanchez seemingly having a novice coach as the only man in his corner increased the interest in the Chiesa fight, as fans had a morbid curiosity to see if there was any method to the madness or whether it would end in disaster. And unsurprisingly, it was a disaster, as Diego was demolished for 3 rounds on his way to a unanimous decision loss in a fight where he landed an abysmal 7 significant strikes and was controlled at will on the ground by Chiesa. The performance in the cage was a disaster, but it went from bad to worse for Diego and Joshua Fabia, as details would later emerge of the training Diego had done in the run-up to the fight, which included bizarre footage of Joshua Fabia chasing Diego and others around a locked octagon with a knife, with the reasoning being, I guess, if you can dodge a knife, you can dodge a punch? A few months down the line, and even more bizarre stuff would come out, when it was revealed that before the Chiesa fight, Fabia had warned the UFC and Nevada Athletic Commission that he had taught Diego a choke so dangerous that it could paralyze or even kill Chiesa if Diego decided to use it in the fight. This news got back to Chiesa, who allegedly had found it hilarious, particularly when he was given a demonstration of the move and it resembled a stone cold stunner. Criticism of Fabia was compounded by his corner advice between rounds getting ridiculed. Diego had been getting dominated on the ground, and yet Fabia's main piece of advice was that Diego needed to be more like Mike Tyson, truly elite coaching. This dumb advice earned Fabia criticism from Joe Rogan on his podcast, which truly, and I mean truly, angered Joshua Fabia, to the point he would bring up Joe Rogan's criticism over and over again for the next few years.
Coach that would be Diego Sanchez's corner. No one else. This dude has no experience as an MMA coach, by the way. So this is the dude that's telling him to be like Tyson.
He's being like water right now. You
What is
see
he
that
doing?
slip? That slip,
bro.
Oh.
Well,
So overall, the Chiesa fight was an absolute disaster for Diego Sanchez, and especially Joshua Fabia. And with that fight being the last one on Sanchez's UFC contract, some may have questioned if the UFC might let him walk. But Diego's status as a winner on the original Ultimate Fighter meant he was one of Dana White's absolute favourites, and there was no chance Dana would let him go, with Diego signing a new 5-fight contract with the company. Diego was well respected in the sport, and most would have been hoping that after the disaster that was the Chiesa fight, he would part ways with Joshua Fabia and find a more conventional coaching team for future fights. But this did not happen, and Fabia used the intense criticism they were getting to create a siege-type mentality of Diego and Fabia versus the MMA world, thus increasing Diego's dependency on him and alienating him from anyone who was telling him to leave Fabia. These are common tactics used by cult leaders in places such as Scientology or Jonestown, for example. There is something so incredibly frustrating about brainwashing like this, when everyone but the victim can see the lies being told by a fraudster, but the victim refuses to believe. I covered a similar story in American football in my video on Adam Moema, who was brainwashed into a cult and walked away from an NFL contract. This shows it's not just Diego who falls victim to these kinds of predators. Diego Sanchez was so highly thought of in MMA and had people trying to look out for his best interests, but Fabia manipulated Diego into thinking they just didn't believe in him like his ex-wife, and Diego Sanchez stopped listening to the doubters. And so the Joshua Fabia-led circus rolled into another fight, this time against Michel Pereira, with Fabia again the only man in Sanchez's corner, despite huge and increasing levels of criticism, which Fabia put down to a Joe Rogan-led conspiracy against him.
And on top of it, the criticism truly starts from Joe Rogan's dumbass talking out of turn, slandering somebody, doing malfeasance in the audience eyes and everything because he didn't do his due diligence to find out who I was.
Diego would actually win this fight against Pereira, who is a pretty good fighter all things considered. However, the manner of this victory was not quite enough to crown Fabia as a genius coach. Pereira absolutely dominated the fight for 2 rounds before getting himself disqualified in the 3rd round for an illegal knee. So technically it was a win, but in reality, Sanchez was completely bailed out to a win. Joshua Fabia again caused controversy with his nonsensical corner advice, as he told Sanchez that Pereira's takedown had won Pereira round 2, even though Sanchez had been completely outclassed in the striking department as well. Despite the lucky nature of the win, Diego was quick to credit Joshua Fabia for the win and for getting him ready to perform at the best of his ability, and Fabia definitely wasn't shy about taking the praise. Fabia seemingly viewed this win as proving all of the haters and criticism wrong, even though Diego's performance had been horrible the entire fight. He went on several more rants about Joe Rogan and the conspiracy he believed Rogan was pushing to turn everyone against him. When he wasn't going off at Rogan, he was demanding praise and promoting his school of self-awareness with several unhinged and completely nonsensical rants in various interviews as he declared war on the MMA media and made himself the center of attention whenever possible. If Diego hadn't ditched Joshua Fabia after his loss against Chiesa, then it wasn't surprising when he didn't change coaches after winning the Pereira fight, even though he'd looked terrible. And so, the Joshua Fabia circus rolled into yet another fight when Diego Sanchez was pitted against Jake Matthews at UFC 253 on Fight Island. This fight underlined again why Joshua Fabia had no business coaching a UFC fighter. It's one thing for Diego's performances to decline under Fabia, which in itself is bad, but when Diego Sanchez showed up for the Jake Matthews fight, visibly out of shape, it showed how awfully prepared Fabia was making him for these fights. You don't need to be a genius coach to ensure your fighter is in semi-decent shape, but Fabia couldn't even manage that. Diego was again soundly beaten for 2 rounds and needing another miracle to get the winners under Joshua Fabia. There was no miracle this time, and Diego was soundly beaten by unanimous decision. His previous performances under Fabia had been bad, but this one was even more depressing because he hadn't even arrived in good condition to give himself a chance. In just 3 fights, Joshua Fabia had taken Diego from absolutely dominating Mickey Gall and underlining his status as a gatekeeper in the UFC to getting battered consistently and being the biggest underdog on the entire card. But no matter how bad things got for Diego Sanchez, he would at least always have Dana White and the UFC in his corner, offering him fights even if it was looking like he was finished as a fighter. Another thing that Diego had going for him is that no matter how embarrassing his performance was, Joshua Fabia would always go out of his way to embarrass himself even more and take some of the attention off of Diego. Footage recorded and leaked by Fabia of Diego Sanchez's pre-fight meeting with the broadcast team showed Fabia hijacking the entire meeting to go on yet another rant about the conspiracy against him in front of a bewildered Paul Felder and Megan Levy, who were both clearly not part of the Joshua Fabia fan club.
That's interesting when all I'm doing is bringing light
I
to
didn't
this
sign
man.
up for your lecture class.
I'm out, man. Nobody wanted to lecture you.
Press the green button.
None of them can be skewed to determine what they're going to say on TV because you don't like the narrative that they went down. That's not how the commentary works. What articles are read, we don't write articles, right? That's not a part of our job.
Ironically, the head of the School of Self-Awareness was amazingly consistent at showing that he had absolutely no self-awareness. There was another hilarious clip to come from the Jake Matthews fight when Fabia decided to confront and attempt to intimidate former UFC champion Matt Serra for not saying Joshua Fabia's name on a podcast with Diego that took place over 6 months ago.
You trying to come over here and make some kind of grandstand about, you're bringing me up about, no, listen, bro. Okay. You want to talk? I'll talk. You're bringing up Michael Pereira. I think the guy's a stud. Who? You're,
Piera?
Yeah, Pereira. Don't, you're going to fix my pronunciation. Oh, yeah,
I'm
okay.
just sitting here.
So, to recap, in the space of a few days, Fabia coached Diego to his worst ever performance, embarrassed himself with the production team, and then completely embarrassed himself with Matt Serra, with everything being captured on camera. Joshua Fabia was the joke of mixed martial arts. At this point, considering Diego was losing badly, exhibiting erratic behavior, and didn't seem to be taking MMA at all seriously, judging by his choice of coach and his lack of conditioning, it might have been expected that the UFC cut him. But as stated before, Diego was a made man in the UFC, and they stuck by him and offered him not just a fight, but a pretty decent fight against another legend on his way out of the game in Donald Cerrone. But this was the fight where everything would finally unravel for both Diego Sanchez and Joshua Fabia. Heading into the Donald Cerrone fight, Fabia ramped up the next stage of his con, and it would end disastrously for Diego Sanchez. Fabia began to make it clear through interviews with the media that he felt like the UFC had been conspiring against Diego by giving him mismatches and making him take extremely unnecessary amounts of punishment against young and hungry fighters. He also brought up the amount of damage Diego had been taking throughout his 15-year-long UFC career and made it clear that he was concerned for Diego's long-term health. Diego Sanchez having CTE was not a new theory in MMA, with many fans thinking CTE would be the only explanation for Diego aligning himself with someone as useless as Joshua Fabia. But for a fighter's coach to be openly pushing the idea that the UFC was allowing fighters with CTE to keep fighting was a huge problem for the company. Fabia took this a step further in the run-up to the Cerrone fight, when he requested the UFC send him a record of every single injury that Diego had ever suffered during his career, to allow Fabia to assess the long-term effects of Diego's MMA career on his health. This request made the UFC realize that Fabia planned to try and sue the UFC for allowing Diego Sanchez to fight while showing signs of CTE, so that Diego Sanchez would get a payout and Fabia would take half, something Diego himself has confirmed.
Mentor was guiding me in what was best for him, and what was best for him was to try to figure out a way to get a settlement with the UFC. And so, he knew, that if there was a major settlement with the UFC, that, I was going to hook him up with half, because it was all his idea. It was all his plan. He was masterminding everything.
This was obviously a massive liability for the UFC and put the Cerrone fight in doubt, leading to a phone call between UFC legal head Hunter Campbell and Joshua Fabia, in which Campbell stated that if Diego was experiencing health issues, then he should not be fighting.
The direct quote that I received was, you stated that the, quote, long-term effects of Diego being an MMA fighter were your basis for requesting it. Yeah. So I went through this with Mark Hunt, and here's the reality. If you're concerned or he's concerned that he's having negative effects, then we're not going to fight him. And I'm going to pull the fight right now. And we're going to call it a day, and we'll release him, and he can go do something else with his life. Because I'm not putting anybody in that cage that doesn't feel 100% or thinks they're suffering from any medical issues.
As Diego had passed all of his pre-fight medicals and scans, he was cleared to fight. But the UFC wanted Fabia to state in writing that Diego Sanchez was in good health before they would allow the fight to go ahead. Fabia's refusal to cooperate would lead to the fight getting officially cancelled. But even worse, Fabia's actions led Dana White and the UFC to release Diego Sanchez from his UFC contract, feeling that it wasn't worth the hassle of dealing with the Diego Sanchez circus anymore, even if Diego Sanchez was one of Dana's favourite fighters. Sanchez effectively once had a contract to fight in the UFC for as long as he wanted, but Fabia had managed to help him blow it, and Diego Sanchez was out in the MMA wilderness for the first time in over 15 years. After the Sanchez-Cerrone fight was officially cancelled, Diego, or perhaps Fabia I should say, took to Instagram to express he was happy to finally be free of the UFC, while tagging a bunch of alternative MMA promotions, keen to get back to fighting. But Diego and Fabia had horribly overestimated the demand for Diego, as almost every promotion wanted nothing to do with the clown show that was Joshua Fabia. Bellator quickly ruled themselves out, and there was scant interest elsewhere. The realization of the terrible situation he'd put himself in seemed to hit Diego Sanchez pretty quickly, leading to this very emotional interview where Diego seemed devastated by the fact that Dana hadn't stood by him.
Well, I'm still open to meet with you, Dana. Be a man. Be a real boss. When I've bled, I've sweat, I've cried. I've cried for this company. I sacrificed more than you will ever know. And you can't have a 45 minutes to meet with it? Oh, but you'll meet with Clay.
But then in the same interview, Diego showed exactly why the UFC had no choice but to cut him, when he claimed the UFC might try to kill him to silence him.
I'm going to tell you guys both frankly right now, I'm fearful, man. I'm fearful for my life. I'm fearful that this company, this billion-dollar monopoly company worldwide is going to come after me. Something might happen to me in 2 years, maybe in a couple years. Maybe something happened. Maybe my truck fall. Maybe I wrecked my truck. Maybe something happened. Maybe Diego overdosed on some suicide. I don't know. but I would not put anything past the level of evil that is within this corporation.
With the UFC now out of the picture, Diego became even more dependent on Joshua Fabia and was heading off the deep end into ridiculous conspiracy theories, such as thinking the UFC was paying social media companies and running bot accounts just to slander Diego and Fabia.
Little sheep, you're following the narrative, you're believing what these fake little robot fake accounts are putting up. Con, all this strange. Go on there right now. You go look at, and you will see these fake accounts. While they're starting to change now, they're starting to take them off. But thank God that I got a smart coach. We've been documenting this. We've been documenting all of this.
Joshua Fabia's cult leader tendencies were on show again too. The cult of Scientology has a process called disconnection, in which it encourages Scientology followers to cut off any family or friends who criticize Scientology or try to get them to leave the church. This massively increases their dependency on Scientology, as they have burnt bridges with their loved ones. Fabia employed a similar playbook on Diego Sanchez, who would admit he had disowned some of his family for criticizing the way Joshua Fabia had been handling his career. Then maybe the weirdest video of them all would emerge after Diego Sanchez's UFC release, when training footage showing Diego hanging upside down and being used as a punch bag by Joshua Fabia was released by none other than Joshua Fabia. This was the exact same guy who wanted to sue the UFC for giving Diego Sanchez CTE. Diego Sanchez had been turned into the biggest laughingstock in the sport and was showing no signs of turning his back on the man destroying his career and reputation. But there was a shocking twist. When a week after the release of the Punching Bag Diego video, Diego announced that he had parted company with Joshua Fabia with immediate effect. This was great news for the friends and fans of Diego Sanchez, but if you thought that this breakup was going to be smooth sailing, then you haven't been paying attention, because it got messy fast. Considering that Joshua Fabia had coached Diego to the worst performances of his career, cost Diego his UFC contract, ruined Diego's public image, and alienated him from friends and family, you might assume that if anyone would be bitter about their time working together, then it would be Diego Sanchez, but actually, it was the complete opposite. In the immediate aftermath of the split, Diego Sanchez refused to trash his former friend, coach, manager, mentor, spiritual guru, and OnlyFans manager. Yeah, that happened by the way. Diego was repeatedly asked to discuss his time with Fabia, but took the high road and said very little on the matter, other than to express his wish to move on and continue his career. Fabia, however, did not take the breakup with the same grace as Diego, even though he was the one completely at fault. His first move was to pull the classic, "she didn't dump me, I dumped her" tactic, claiming he'd been the one to drop Diego. He then questioned Diego's character, claiming he saw red flags from the minute they met. This in itself was disrespectful, given Diego had placed complete and total faith in Joshua Fabia for awful results. But Fabia wasn't done there. Oh no, not by a long shot. Fabia's next move was to bring up Diego's financial issues and addiction problems to score points for himself as some kind of savior, before he then mocked Diego Sanchez for allegedly being in special education as a kid. Next, Fabia brought up the Chiesa fight and made the extremely damaging and slanderous claim that Diego Sanchez had been told by the commission to throw the fight and lose on purpose. To accuse a competitor like Diego, who'd given so much to the sport, of losing on purpose was a serious insult. Now, if someone betrayed and tarnished my name like this after they screwed me over, I'd be throwing back all kinds of venom at them. But Diego, again, surprisingly took the high road and refused to come back with criticism, instead focusing on trying to forge a road back to fighting without the creep in his corner. It was very honourable of him and not something that I could have done, especially considering what Fabia had cost him. The damage done to Diego's credibility made it hard for him to bounce back with a promotion like Bellator or ONE FC, but he did eventually make his return to the cage with Khabib's promotion, Eagle FC, where he fought against Kevin Lee. Diego would lose a rather one-sided fight, despite injuring Lee's leg early in the fight, but in fairness to Diego, Kevin Lee is fairly young, pretty good, and he's back in the UFC now, so it's not an awful loss, all things considered, given Diego is in his 40s. Diego Sanchez has also recently made his bare-knuckle boxing debut in 2023, where he unfortunately lost via doctor stoppage in the 4th round to Austin Trout. Aged 41, I hope Diego decides to hang up the gloves for good soon, as he has taken a serious amount of damage in his legendary career, but he does love fighting, so it wouldn't surprise me if he continues for as long as he possibly can, which in MMA can be a very, 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 very long time. While Diego refused to trash Fabia in the immediate aftermath of their breakup, he did eventually open up on the topic a bit and bashed Fabia, accusing him of only doing what was best for him and sabotaging Diego's UFC career in the process.
Conspiracy with Joshua Fabia, like the most craziest ever. Like, no UFC career has ever ended the way my UFC career ended, and it is what it is. Stuff that's Joshua Fabia, and with the medicals and just pushing all the wrong buttons at the UFC, you know, working his ass off to do whatever was best for his intentions.
Diego Sanchez has also mentioned that he has repaired his relationship with Dana White. Now he is free of Fabia, and there is a lot of mutual respect between the two, with Diego Sanchez a certainty to end up in the UFC Hall of Fame.
And me and Dana, you know, we've been talking. We're cool. We mended, you know. Dana told me, I got nothing but love and respect for you, Diego Sanchez. And that's, you know, so in the future, you know, I'd like to meet up with Dana and, you know, give him a handshake and tell him thank you for everything that the UFC did for me, giving me all these great opportunities.
Even with the bad things Diego Sanchez has mentioned about Fabia, he is still complimentary to him in many ways, which is kind of worrying. He describes Fabia as a badass trainer who taught him a lot.
People can talk about Fabia all day, but man, that was a badass trainer, man. And I learned a lot from him, man.
And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like he's seen through all of Fabia's BS, as he still believes in the death choke, for example, and even believes in Fabia potentially being a contract killer. But irregardless, Diego Sanchez is completely free of Joshua Fabia, and while his UFC career is over, he is still cashing checks and fighting to this day, and hopefully he will live a long, healthy and happy life even after he's done fighting. For Joshua Fabia, he is thankfully largely faded back into obscurity, but there are interviews out there on YouTube of him discussing his time in the UFC and his life philosophy. But to be honest, listening to this guy talk is so painful that I can't bring myself to sit through an entire 90-minute interview of him rambling, even on 2x speed, so apologies for that. Joshua Fabia's time in the UFC will go down in history as one of, if not the weirdest moments of modern mixed martial arts, without a shadow of a doubt. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like to help the channel and subscribe for more interesting sports stories like this one. If you're looking for another video to watch, then check out this video I made on the story of the craziest fighter in MMA history, or check out some of the other playlists on the channel. Thanks for taking the time to watch, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.